Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we're journeying through the world of Regency gossip, those printed sheets and scandal columns that captured the intimate dramas of Georgian high society. We'll explore where this fascination with celebrity news began, what the scandal sheets actually contained, and how the printed word transformed the social landscape of early 19th century England. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're here to drift into sleep or to follow the currents of history, I'm glad you're with me. Now let's begin. Picture London in the early 1800s. The streets narrow as they wind toward St. James, and the air carries the smell of coal smoke mixed with horse dung and the faint sweetness of pastries from a baker's window. In the coffee houses, men sit with newspapers spread before them, the paper still smelling of ink so fresh it might smudge if you touch it carelessly. The pages rustle as they turn, and someone laughs, a sharp sound that cuts through the low murmur of conversation. Outside, a woman walks past in a dress of pale muslin, and every eye follows her because she was mentioned in yesterday's column. Her name was given only as initials, but everyone knows. Everyone always knows. This was the world of Regency scandal sheets, a world where information moved like water through the streets of London, pooling in coffee houses and drawing rooms, carried in pockets and passed from hand to hand. The printed word had become as essential to daily life as bread or tea. When you woke in the morning, you might open your newspaper to find your neighbor's indiscretion laid bare in careful prose, their identity hidden behind initials but recognizable to anyone who cared to look. The gossip was there on the page, permanent as ink, impossible to take back. What made this possible was something that had been building for decades, a revolution in how information moved through society. By the time the Regency began, London had become a city of newspapers. Daily newspapers, weekly papers, monthly magazines, all competing for readers and filling their columns with every kind of news that might prove interesting. Politics occupied some space, certainly, and international affairs when they seemed important enough. But a significant portion of these pages was devoted to something else entirely: the comings and goings of high society, the marriages and affairs and scandals of the wealthy and titled, the celebrities of the day. The word celebrity meant something different then, though not so different as you might imagine. These were not actors in moving pictures or musicians on recordings. These were the aristocrats, the dukes and duchesses, the sons and daughters of ancient families who spent their seasons in London, attending balls and soirees and assemblies. They were celebrities because they had wealth and titles, yes, but also because they lived their lives in public view. They attended the same parties, walked in the same gardens, sat in the same boxes at the theatre. London society was a small world, really, concentrated in a few streets around St. James and Mayfair, and everyone within that world was watching everyone else. The hunger for news about these people extended far beyond London itself. In Bath, in York, in provincial towns across England, readers opened their newspapers eager to learn what the fashionable world was doing. What were they wearing? Who was courting whom? Which marriages seemed likely and which seemed to be falling apart? The newspapers fed this hunger with columns that went by names like Fashionable Intelligence, and readers consumed these reports with the same attention they might give to political news or accounts of foreign wars. The print revolution that made all this possible had its roots in the late 17th century, when licensing restrictions that had controlled what could be printed simply lapsed and fell away. Suddenly, anyone with access to a printing press could produce whatever they liked. Pamphlets multiplied, newspapers emerged, books and magazines and broadsides flooded the streets. Over the following century, improvements in printing technology made it possible to produce more material, faster and cheaper than ever before. By the Regency period, the sheer volume of printed matter circulating through London was staggering. Every scandal, every interesting story, every tale worth telling found its way into print somehow. Walk through London in 1810 and you would have seen this everywhere. In shop windows, newspapers hung on display. In coffee houses, the latest editions lay scattered across tables. Men stood on corners selling broadsheets and pamphlets. The printed word was woven into the fabric of daily life in a way that would have been unimaginable just a few generations earlier. This was a revolution comparable to the internet in our own time, a complete transformation in how people accessed information, how they understood the world beyond their immediate experience, how they connected with the larger currents of their society. The newspapers themselves had a particular quality you could recognize if you held one in your hands. The paper was coarse, not smooth like modern newsprint, and it felt slightly damp to the touch in the morning air. The ink smelled sharp and chemical. The type was dense, columns of text marching down the page with very little white space to rest the eye. There were few illustrations, and those that existed were simple woodcuts or engravings. The content was what mattered, the words themselves, the information they carried, the stories they told. In a column devoted to fashionable intelligence, you might read that Lord B had been seen at the theatre in the company of a certain actress, whose name was discreetly omitted, or that Lady S had hosted a ball at which the Prince of Wales himself appeared, staying until the early hours of morning, or that Miss Ski had been observed dancing twice with Mr. F at an assembly in Mayfair, and speculation naturally followed about whether an engagement might be announced before the season ended. These reports were written in a style that managed to be both formal and gossipy, maintaining a veneer of respectable reporting, while making it perfectly clear that scandal was afoot. The codes used to protect identities were transparent to anyone in the know. If a report mentioned a lord whose name began with B, and who had something to do with Bridges, perhaps a reference to his estate or his coat of arms, then readers would understand immediately which lord was meant. The newspapers operated in this space between discretion and revelation, naming without naming, telling secrets while claiming to preserve them. This careful dance was partly about avoiding libel suits, which could be expensive and embarrassing. But it also added to the pleasure of reading. There was a game to it, a puzzle to solve, a sense of being part of an inner circle that understood the hidden meanings. Libel laws did exist, and they had teeth. A publisher who directly named someone in connection with scandalous behavior could find himself in court facing serious consequences, but the laws had loopholes large enough to drive a coach through. As long as you used initials hinted rather than stated outright, as long as you maintained some degree of deniability, you could print almost anything, and so the newspapers did. The content of these scandal sheets focused overwhelmingly on love, sex, and marriage. This was the currency that mattered most in high society. Marriages were not simply romantic unions but political and economic alliances, joining families and fortunes together. Who married whom had implications that extended far beyond the happiness of the couple involved. It affected inheritance, property, political influence, social standing. An advantageous marriage could secure a family's position for generations. A poor marriage or a failed marriage could be ruinous. The newspapers reported on all of it. They tracked eligible bachelors and marriageable young women through the social season, noting who danced with whom at which ball, who sat together at dinner parties, whose names appeared linked in the guest lists of fashionable events. When an engagement was announced, it made the papers. When a wedding took place, the details were reported, what the bride wore, who attended, how much was spent on the celebration. And when marriages faltered, as some inevitably did, that too became news. Affairs were a constant source of scandal and fascination. The aristocratic world had its own unwritten rules about such things. A married man taking a mistress was generally considered acceptable, provided he was discreet. A married woman taking a lover was far more serious. The question of inheritance, of legitimate heirs, made female infidelity a matter of property law as much as morality. When rumors of an affair began to circulate, when they made their way into print, the consequences for a woman could be severe. Social exile was a real possibility. Some women disappeared from London society for years, sent away to country estates or to travel abroad until the scandal faded from memory. The newspapers knew this and they printed the rumors anyway. Sometimes the reports were cruel in their precision, describing exactly where a lady had been seen with a gentleman who was not her husband, what time of day it was, who else might have witnessed the encounter. Other times the reporting took a more playful tone, treating the whole thing as an amusing drama playing out for public entertainment. But underneath the varying tones, there was always the understanding that reputations hung in the balance, that what appeared in print could alter the course of a life. Consider Lady Jersey, one of the great hostesses of the Regency era. She controlled access to Almack's, the most exclusive assembly rooms in London, and her approval or disapproval could make or break a young woman's social prospects. She appeared regularly in the newspapers, her parties reported in detail, her guest lists scrutinized for meaning. To be invited to one of her events was to be somebody, to be excluded was a kind of social death. The newspapers made her power visible, reporting on it, reinforcing it through constant attention. She was a celebrity because the papers said she was, and she remained a celebrity as long as they kept writing about her. The Prince of Wales occupied a similar position at the apex of celebrity culture. His movements were endlessly fascinating to newspaper readers. Where he went, whom he spoke with, what he wore, how much he spent, all of it was news. His relationships were particularly scrutinized. His marriage to Princess Caroline was notoriously unhappy, and the papers reported on their estrangement with barely concealed glee. His various romantic attachments, his friendships with fashionable women, his presence at parties and pleasure gardens, all of this fed the appetite for royal gossip that has never really diminished in English culture. Then there were the young aristocratic men, the rakes and dandies and gamblers who populated the clubs of St. James. These men lived fast lives fueled by inherited wealth and very little responsibility. They raced horses and bet enormous sums on the outcomes. They attended every fashionable event and competed to be seen as leaders of style. Some of them drank to excess. Some accumulated debts that would have bankrupted lesser families. And the newspapers chronicled all of it, sometimes with admiration for their spirit and dash, sometimes with disapproval of their excesses, but always with keen interest. The women who attracted these men's attention fell into different categories, and the papers reported on them differently. There were the respectable young ladies of good family, the potential brides who appeared at balls and assemblies in their finest gowns. These women were treated with a degree of protective discretion in the press. Their reputations mattered too much to be carelessly damaged. Then there were the courtesans and high-class mistresses, women of beauty and wit who lived in a demi-monde that intersected with but existed apart from respectable society. These women could be written about more freely, their names and activities reported with less concern for consequences. In the Regency period, actresses occupied a unique position in the social landscape. They were public figures by profession, performing on stage before audiences that included the highest ranks of society. Some of them were immensely talented, celebrated for their skill in particular roles. Some were known more for their beauty than their acting ability. Either way, they were famous, their names known across England, their comings and goings reported in the papers alongside those of duchesses and countesses. Elizabeth Farren was one such actress, and her story illustrates how scandal and celebrity intertwined in this world. She was beautiful, talented, and enormously popular. The Earl of Derby, a married man, became completely infatuated with her. He attended every performance, he followed her around London. Caricaturists drew him sitting in his theatre box staring at her, with obvious devotion, while she performed on stage. The newspapers reported on this obsession with a mixture of amusement and disapproval. Everyone knew. His wife knew. Elizabeth Farren knew. And still the Earl pursued her, and the papers continued to write about it. And eventually his marriage ended, and he married Elizabeth Farren and made her a countess, which created a whole new round of scandal and fascination. The caricatures deserve their own consideration in this world of scandal and gossip. These were visual satires, drawings and etchings that circulated alongside the newspapers and often depicted the same people and events. The caricaturist James Gilray was among the most talented and prolific. He lived above a print shop on St. James Street, right in the heart of fashionable London. He attended Parliament and sketched the politicians. He walked the streets and captured the famous faces that passed by. His work was savage and funny and instantly recognizable to anyone who understood the references. Like the newspapers, the caricatures operated through a combination of exposure and code, making private behavior public while maintaining just enough distance to avoid legal trouble. The pleasure gardens Vauxhall and Ranelagh were favorite settings for both gossip and the gathering of gossip. These were outdoor entertainment venues where people of different social ranks mingled more freely than they might at a private ball. There were tree-lined walks where couples could stroll, pavilions where orchestras played, alcoves where one might have a relatively private conversation. The gardens opened in the evening, and as darkness fell and lamps were lit, the atmosphere became more charged, more permissive. Journalists attended these events specifically to observe who was present, who walked with whom, which couples disappeared together into the shadows. The next day, their observations would appear in print. The information that found its way into newspapers came from multiple sources. Some of it was simply observed firsthand by journalists who attended public events. Some was leaked by people within high society itself, individuals who wanted certain information made public for their own reasons. A hostess might send details of her party to the newspapers, wanting everyone to know how much she had spent, how elaborate her entertainment had been, who had attended. This was a form of social competition played out through the press. Other information came from servants, from shop owners, from anyone who might witness something interesting and pass it along to someone who would pay for the story. The result was that very little remained truly private in this world. If you were part of London's fashionable society, you had to assume that anything you did might be reported. Where you went, whom you spoke with, what you purchased, how you spent your time, all of it was potentially news. This created a constant awareness of being watched, of performing for an audience, even in supposedly private moments. It also created opportunities for managing one's reputation through strategic releases of information. If a scandal was brewing, you might try to get ahead of it by having your version of events printed first. If you wanted to be seen as fashionable and important, you made sure your name appeared in the right columns in the right contexts. For women especially, the stakes of this publicity were high. A woman's reputation was fragile, easily damaged and difficult to repair. The double standard was stark and well understood. A man could have affairs, could gamble and drink and accumulate debts, and while this might be reported with some disapproval, it rarely resulted in social exile. A woman whose affair became public knowledge faced much more serious consequences. She might be excluded from respectable society entirely, forbidden from attending the events and parties that made up the social season. Some women retreated to their country estates and remained there for years. Others left England altogether, travelling to the continent where they could live more freely, away from the scrutiny of London society and its newspapers. The strategies for managing scandal were well developed by the Regency period. One approach was to maintain appearances no matter what. If rumours were circulating about your marriage, you made sure to be seen in public with your spouse, attending parties together, presenting a united front. The newspapers would report these appearances, and the mere fact of being seen together could help contain the damage. Another strategy was simply to disappear for a while. You would announce that you were going to Bath for your health, or travelling to visit relatives in the country, or suddenly developing an interest in gardening that required your full attention at your estate. This allowed time for the scandal to fade from the newspapers and from public memory. After a sufficient interval, you could return to London and resume your place in society. The scandal, now old news, no longer interesting enough to write about. The novels of the period reflected this world of scandal and gossip with remarkable accuracy. Some novelists, like Lady Charlotte Bury, wrote what were called society novels, fictional stories set in the fashionable world that were thinly veiled accounts of real events and real people. The characters in these novels had different names than their real-life counterparts, but the details were close enough that anyone familiar with London society could identify them. Sometimes the true identities were gradually revealed through clues embedded in the narrative. Other times a key would be published months after the novel, explicitly identifying who each character represented. These novels sold well precisely because of this connection to real scandal. Readers enjoyed the game of figuring out who was who, and they enjoyed the insider knowledge that came with recognizing the people and events being depicted. The magazines added another layer to this culture of information and gossip. Town and Country magazine was particularly known for its coverage of relationships and affairs. The Ladies' magazine published essays and stories, some by anonymous authors who might well have been members of the aristocracy themselves. Women with intimate knowledge of the world they were describing. These publications reached readers across England, bringing news of London society to provincial towns, feeding the hunger for information about the fashionable world. The question of truth in these scandal sheets is an interesting one. By and large, the information reported appears to have been accurate. This makes sense when you consider that the world being written about was small and enclosed. London society consisted of a few thousand people at most, all concentrated in a few neighborhoods, all attending the same events. In such a world, false information would be quickly identified as false. The reporters and publishers had reputations to maintain. If they printed things that were demonstrably untrue, they would lose credibility and readers. So while the style might be gossipy and the tone might be salacious, the underlying facts were generally reliable. There were certainly cases where the reporting was coded so cleverly that even historians examining the newspapers, centuries later, cannot identify exactly who was being written about or what exactly was being said. The references might be so obscure, the connections so dependent on insider knowledge, that the meaning has been lost. In these cases, We cannot verify whether the report was true or false. We can only note that something was being said about someone, and that the original readers would have understood what we cannot. The circulation of these newspapers and scandal sheets happened through various channels. In London, you could purchase them at news shops or have them delivered to your home. Coffee houses subscribed to multiple papers and kept them available for patrons to read. Men's clubs like White's and Brooks's maintained reading rooms, stocked with the latest publications. People passed newspapers to friends and family, included clippings and letters, discussed what they had read over dinner and at parties. The information moved through the social network as a kind of currency, valuable because it was interesting, because it gave you something to talk about, because it connected you to the larger world of fashionable society. Outside London, newspapers travelled by mail coach. Provincial papers often reprinted columns from London newspapers, so the same scandal that was being discussed in a St. James coffee house one morning might be read in York or Bath a few days later. This created a shared culture of information across England, a sense that everyone was following the same stories, aware of the same scandals, familiar with the same cast of celebrity characters. The comparison to modern celebrity culture is impossible to avoid. Sincerest the appetite for information about famous people's private lives, the mixture of admiration and judgment, the sense that public figures have somehow forfeited their right to privacy, all of this existed in Regency England. The mechanisms were different. There was no social media, no instant global communication, but the underlying dynamics were remarkably similar. Famous people attracted attention. Their lives became entertainment for others. Scandal sold newspapers then just as it sells magazines and drives internet traffic now. What has changed is perhaps the degree of control that celebrities themselves have over their image. In the Regency period, once information made it into print, there was very little a person could do to counter it or remove it from circulation. You could not delete a tweet or issue a public statement on Instagram. You could try to manage your reputation through strategic appearances and carefully leaked information, but you could not directly control what was written about you. The power lay with the publishers and editors and writers, with the people who decided what was newsworthy and how it would be presented. The cultural moment that produced this explosion of scandal sheets and gossip columns was specific to its time in some ways. The combination of technological advancement in printing, the concentration of wealthy society in London for the political season, the development of a reading public hungry for news, all of these factors came together in a particular way during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And yet the fundamental human interests being served were timeless. People have always been curious about the lives of those who are wealthy or powerful or beautiful or famous. We have always enjoyed stories about love and betrayal, about success and failure, about the private dramas of public figures. The scandal sheets of Regency England gave form to these interests through the medium of print. They created a public conversation about private behavior. They made celebrities into characters in an ongoing story that played out in the newspapers day after day, week after week, season after season. And they did this with a combination of factual reporting and artful suggestion, naming without naming, revealing while claiming to preserve discretion, walking the line between information and entertainment in a way that their readers found endlessly fascinating. As the evening grows later and we consider this world of gossip and scandal from a distance of 2 centuries, certain patterns emerge. The names change, but the stories remain familiar. Someone falls in love unwisely. Someone's marriage fails. Someone spends too much money or drinks too much or gambles away their fortune. Someone rises to prominence and someone falls from grace. And all of it gets written down, printed, circulated, discussed, remembered, and eventually forgotten as new scandals emerge to take their place. The physical newspapers themselves have mostly crumbled away, the cheap paper they were printed on, not meant to last centuries, but many were preserved in archives and libraries, bound volumes of yellowing pages that historians can still read today. The caricatures survive in museums and private collections. The society novels remain on library shelves. And through these sources, we can still see into that world, can still read the gossip that captivated readers 200 years ago, can still trace the scandals that once seemed so important, so urgent, so fascinating. What we find when we read these sources is a world that feels both distant and familiar. The language is formal, the references often obscure, but the human concerns are recognizable. The desire to know what others are doing, the pleasure of gossip, the fascination with fame. These things have not changed. They connect us across centuries to people we will never meet. People who lived in a world very different from ours but who shared certain fundamental interests and curiosities that remain constant across time. The gossip columns and scandal sheets of Regency England were one moment in a much longer story about how information circulates, how reputations are made and destroyed, how private lives become public entertainment. That story continues today in different forms, through different media, but with many of the same underlying dynamics. We are not so different from those readers who opened their newspapers in 1810 to see what scandal had emerged overnight. We are still curious, we are still drawn to stories about the famous and powerful. We still enjoy the glimpse into lives that seem more glamorous or dramatic than our own. And so the scandal sheets endure not as physical objects, those have mostly disappeared, but as evidence of something persistent in human nature. We want to know. We want to be part of the conversation, to feel connected to the larger world beyond our immediate experience. The Regency gossip columns served that need in their time, and their modern equivalents serve it in ours. The names and faces change, the technology evolves, but the essential hunger for information, for gossip, for scandal, for stories about other people's lives remains the same. In the quiet of the evening, we can imagine those long-ago readers sitting with their newspapers, learning about which lord had been seen with which actress, which marriage was rumored to be failing, which party had been the most extravagant. We can picture them discussing these stories over tea or in coffee houses, sharing information, speculating about what would happen next. And we can recognize in their behavior something of our own, can see how the tools change but the interests remain constant, can understand that the world of Regency scandal sheets and the world of modern celebrity gossip are not really so different after all. Both speak to the same curiosities, serve the same needs, satisfy the same desires to know and to share and to be part of the ongoing conversation about the lives of those who capture our attention and our imagination. The mechanics of how these publications came into being deserve consideration. Someone had to write them, someone had to print them. The process began in rooms that smelled of ink and metal, where compositors set type letter by letter, building words and sentences from individual pieces of lead. The work was skilled and tedious. Each letter had to be placed correctly, each word spaced properly, each line justified to fit the column width. A single page might take hours to prepare. The printing presses themselves were loud machines, all wood and iron and moving parts. The pressman worked in rhythm, inking the type, positioning the paper, pulling the lever that brought the press down and transferred ink to paper. The sound was regular as a heartbeat, thump slide, and it continued for hours as the day's edition was printed. The smell of ink filled the room, thick and almost sweet, mixing with the smell of paper and machine oil and the sweat of the men working. Once printed, the newspapers had to be distributed. Boys carried bundles through the streets, calling out headlines to attract buyers. News agents received their allotments and displayed them in shop windows. Subscribers had papers delivered to their homes by men who walked the same routes every morning, knowing which houses took which publications. But the system worked with surprising efficiency. A scandal that occurred on Monday evening might be printed Tuesday morning and read over breakfast by thousands of people across London. The coffee houses were particularly important nodes in this network of information. A gentleman might stop at his favorite coffee house on his way to Parliament or his club. He would order coffee or chocolate, perhaps something to eat, and settle into a chair with the morning papers. The atmosphere was convivial, sociable. Men discussed the news as they read it, commenting on political developments, laughing over scandalous reports, sharing information they had heard through other channels. The coffee house was where printed news met oral gossip, where the formal reports in newspapers mixed with rumor and speculation, creating a rich stew of information that was then carried out into the wider world as the patrons left and went about their daily business. Women had their own information networks that operated somewhat differently. They could not frequent coffee houses or men's clubs. Their access to newspapers might be controlled by fathers or husbands who decided what was appropriate for them to read, but information flowed through their world nonetheless. They met at morning calls, visiting each other's homes for brief social interactions. They gathered at assembly rooms and balls. They walked in parks and pleasure gardens. And everywhere they met, they talked. They shared what they had read in newspapers and magazines. They passed along gossip they had heard from servants or tradespeople. They discussed who was courting whom, which marriages seemed happy, and which did not, what they had observed at the latest social event. The letters that women wrote to each other were another crucial channel for gossip. A young woman in London might write to her friend in the country, describing the latest scandals of the season. She might include clippings from newspapers, or copy out particularly interesting paragraphs. The letter would travel by mail coach, taking days to arrive, and the friend would read it eagerly, hungry for news from the fashionable world. She might share choice bits with her own social circle, spreading the gossip further. In this way, information rippled outward from London, reaching into corners of England that seemed far removed from the scandals they described. The relationship between the aristocracy and the press was complex and often contradictory. On one hand, members of high society depended on the newspapers to maintain their celebrity status. Being written about was proof of importance. If your name appeared regularly in the fashionable intelligence columns, it meant you mattered, that your activities were considered newsworthy. Some people actively cultivated relationships with editors and journalists, providing information that cast them in a favorable light. They understood that publicity could be managed, that the press could be used to enhance reputation rather than damage it. On the other hand, no one wanted to be the subject of genuinely scandalous reporting. The newspapers could destroy as well as build. A woman whose affair was reported might find herself excluded from society. A man whose debts were detailed in print might struggle to maintain his social position. The boundary between interesting news and damaging scandal was not always clear, and people had to navigate it carefully. This created a constant tension. You wanted to be noticed but not too noticed. You wanted to be written about but only in the right way. The editors who managed these publications wielded considerable power. They decided what was newsworthy and what was not. They determined how stories would be framed, which details would be emphasized, what tone would be taken. A good editor understood their audience, knew what would sell papers, had a sense of how far they could push without crossing legal lines. Some editors were connected to political factions and used their papers to advance particular interests. Others were more independent, pursuing scandals and stories based purely on what they thought readers wanted to know. The writers who actually produced the gossip columns were often anonymous. They might sign their work with pseudonyms or not sign it at all. This anonymity provided protection. If you were going to write about the private lives of powerful people, it helped to be unknown yourself, difficult to identify or confront. Some writers were hired specifically for their ability to produce entertaining gossip. They might attend social events, observe what happened, then write it up in a style that was both informative and amusing. The skill lay in making the mundane interesting, in finding the narrative thread in a simple social encounter, in suggesting scandal without stating it outright. Others who contributed to the scandal sheets were not professional writers at all but members of society themselves. A woman angry at a rival might send information to a newspaper knowing it would be printed. A man seeking to damage someone's reputation might leak details of their behavior. The motivations varied: revenge, jealousy, political advantage, financial gain. But the result was the same. Private information becoming public knowledge. Secrets transformed into news, personal grievances, played out in print for the entertainment of thousands. The visual culture of scandal existed alongside the written word. Print shops sold caricatures that hung in their windows, attracting crowds who stopped to look and laugh. These images were often more explicit than newspaper reports could be. A caricature might show a well-known duke in a compromising position with his mistress, both figures clearly recognizable despite exaggerated features. Or it might depict a political scandal as an elaborate allegory, with famous people portrayed as animals or mythological figures. The best caricatures worked on multiple levels, funny to anyone who looked at them, but richest in meaning for those who understood all the references and recognized all the figures. People collected these caricatures. They purchased prints and framed them or kept them in portfolios. Some caricatures became famous in their own right, widely reproduced and discussed. The most popular ones might sell hundreds of copies. The artists who created them, men like Gilray and Rowlandson and Cruikshank, became celebrities themselves in a way their work eagerly anticipated, their style instantly recognizable. The relationship between visual and written scandal was symbiotic. A story might first appear as gossip in a newspaper column, then be taken up by a caricaturist who would create a visual interpretation. Or a caricature might appear first, depicting some scandal, and newspapers would then report on it, describing the image and its subject. The two forms reinforced each other, creating a multimedia environment of gossip and scandal that surrounded the people of fashionable society. The pleasure gardens deserve more attention as sites where scandal was both created and observed. Vauxhall Gardens in particular had a reputation that mixed respectability with something more risque. The gardens opened at dusk and stayed open late into the night. Entrance required purchasing a ticket, which meant there was some degree of exclusivity, but the price was not so high as to exclude the middling classes. So the gardens attracted a mix of people, aristocrats and merchants, respectable families and couples conducting affairs, tourists and locals. The physical layout of Vauxhall encouraged both public display and private encounter. There were wide promenades where you could walk and see and be seen. The lighting was carefully designed, with thousands of lamps hanging in the trees, creating pools of illumination separated by shadowy spaces. There were supper boxes where you could sit and dine while watching the crowds pass by. There were more secluded walks, darker paths that led away from the main thoroughfares. And there were rotundas and pavilions where orchestras played and entertainers performed. The food served at Vauxhall was famously bad and famously expensive. The thin-sliced ham was a running joke. The rack punch was strong enough to make you forget about the ham. People went not for the food but for the experience, for the chance to be part of this glittering evening world where anything might happen. A young woman might encounter a former lover while walking with her current suitor. A married man might be spotted dining with someone who was decidedly not his wife. These encounters became stories, and stories became gossip, and gossip made its way into the newspapers. Journalists attended Vauxhall specifically to gather material. They would position themselves where they could observe without being obvious about it. They would note who arrived together, who seemed to be trying to avoid being seen together, which couples disappeared down the darker paths. The next day, their observations might appear in print, described with enough detail to make the identities clear, but enough discretion to avoid legal trouble. The people of fashionable society knew this was happening, knew they were being watched, and yet they continued to attend Vauxhall. The theatre was another crucial site in this geography of scandal and gossip. The fashionable theatres, Covent Garden and Drury Lane particularly, were places to see and be seen as much as places to watch performances. The layout of the theatres reflected this. The pit, where seats were cheapest, was for those who actually wanted to watch the play. The boxes, which were expensive and prominently positioned, were for aristocracy. You sat in a box not necessarily because you cared about the play, but because sitting in a box demonstrated your status. The boxes faced each other as much as they faced the stage, and people in the audience spent as much time watching each other as watching the performance. The boxes were semi-private spaces, open to public view but enclosed enough to create a sense of intimacy. Things happened in boxes that were not meant to happen in public. A man might lean too close to a woman who was not his wife. A woman might receive a note passed to her box by a messenger. The nature of these encounters was observed and interpreted by others in the audience, and observations became gossip, and gossip found its way into the scandal sheets. And the actresses on stage were celebrities in a way that was specific to their profession. They were public performers visible to anyone who bought a ticket. Their faces and bodies were on display. Their voices carried through the theatre. When an actress was particularly beautiful or talented, she attracted attention that extended beyond her professional work. Men became obsessed with actresses, pursuing them, trying to arrange introductions, sending gifts and notes. Some actresses became mistresses to aristocrats. Some married into the nobility, though this was rare enough to be remarkable when it happened. The press followed these relationships with great interest. The connection between the Duke of Derby and Elizabeth Farren was reported on extensively. Over the years it developed. Readers followed the story like a serialized novel. Would he leave his wife? Would she agree to become his mistress, or insist on marriage? How would society react? When the Duke's wife finally died and he immediately married Elizabeth, making her a countess, it was a sensation. Some people approved, seeing it as a romantic culmination of years of devotion. Others disapproved, considering it scandalous that an actress should become a countess. The newspapers reported all the reactions, and the story became part of the cultural memory of the age. The opera attracted a somewhat different crowd than the theatre, more cosmopolitan and in some ways more openly scandalous. Opera boxes were expensive enough that only the very wealthy could afford them, and they were treated almost as private rooms. Curtains could be drawn if you wanted privacy. Food and drink could be brought in. The opera was less about watching the performance and more about participating in a social scene that had its own elaborate codes and rituals. Opera singers, like actresses, were celebrities who attracted aristocratic admirers. But opera had closer connections to continental culture, to the more permissive social codes of Italy and France. Mistresses attended the opera openly with their protectors. Affairs were conducted with less pretense of discretion. The newspapers reported on the opera, as they reported on the theatre, noting who sat in which box, who visited whom during intervals. The clubs of St. James Street were exclusively male spaces where much of the gossip about women originated. White's and Brooks's were the most famous, but there were others, each with its own character and membership. These clubs were more than just places to gamble and drink. Though both activities were pursued with enthusiasm, they were centers of social and political power where reputations were made and destroyed over dinner and cards. The betting books at these clubs recorded wagers on everything imaginable. Men bet on horses and boxing matches, certainly, but they also bet on politics, on whether a particular woman would marry a particular man before the season ended, on whether someone would successfully seduce someone else. These bets were recorded in books that members could read, and the contents of the betting books sometimes found their way into newspapers. A wager about a woman's virtue or a man's fidelity, recorded in a club's betting book, and then reported in a scandal sheet, could have serious consequences for the people involved. The clubs were also where men gathered to discuss the latest news, including news about each other. A man might learn over dinner that his wife was being talked about, that rumors were circulating about her behavior. He would have to decide how to respond to ignore it, to confront her, to challenge someone to a duel, to leave London for a while until the gossip died down. The club was where these decisions were made and strategies planned. Duels still happened in this period, though they were technically illegal and becoming less common. When they occurred, they were often the result of scandal and gossip. A man might feel his honor had been impugned by something printed in a newspaper or said at a club. He would issue a challenge. If the challenge was accepted, the two men would meet at dawn in some discreet location. Hyde Park was common with seconds and a surgeon in attendance. The duel might end without bloodshed, honor satisfied by the willingness to fight, or it might end with someone wounded or dead. Either way, the newspapers would report on it, adding another chapter to whatever scandal had prompted the duel in the first place. The question of honor was central to how people navigated this world of public gossip and scandal. Honor was not quite the same as reputation, though the two were related. Reputation was what others thought of you, the sum of what was said and written about you. Honor was something internal, a sense of self-worth and integrity that could be damaged but not destroyed by gossip. A man with honor would defend his name when necessary but would not be overly concerned with every rumor or scandal. A woman with honor would conduct herself properly regardless of what was written about her, but maintaining honor in the face of scandal required resources, social, financial, emotional. You needed friends who would stand by you, family who would support you, enough money to weather any financial consequences. You needed a certain strength of character to endure being discussed and criticized in public. Not everyone had these resources. Some people were destroyed by scandal, their reputations ruined, their social positions lost, their futures diminished. The newspapers that reported on scandals rarely followed up to show these long-term consequences. They moved on to the next story, the next scandal, leaving behind the wreckage of lives permanently altered. The servants who worked in aristocratic households were important sources of information that fed the scandal sheets. A lady's maid knew everything about her mistress, what she wore, where she went, who she met, what letters she received. A valet knew his master's secrets. Footmen and coachmen and housekeepers all had access to information that might be valuable to someone. Some servants were loyal and kept what they knew to themselves. Others were willing to share information for money or out of resentment, or simply because they enjoyed gossip as much as anyone. The relationship between servants and their employers was complex. Servants were dependent on their employers for employment and housing and wages, which created incentives for loyalty. But servants were also underpaid and overworked, treated as less than human by some employers, subjected to harsh discipline for minor infractions. A servant who felt mistreated might see sharing their employer's secrets as a form of revenge. And journalists cultivated relationships with servants, paying for information, making it worthwhile for them to talk. The material that made its way into scandal sheets through servants was often highly detailed and intimate. A report might describe what a lady wore to a secret meeting, down to the color of her dress and the style of her hair. It might mention that a gentleman left his house at midnight and did not return until dawn. These details could only have come from someone inside the household, someone who observed daily life closely. When aristocrats read such reports, they would know that someone in their household had talked, which created an atmosphere of suspicion and distrust. Some aristocratic families responded by trying to control what their servants knew. They would conduct sensitive conversations only in rooms where they were certain they were alone. They would send servants away before discussing anything private. They would hire servants they had reason to believe were trustworthy and pay them well enough to ensure their loyalty. But complete control was impossible. Servants were everywhere in these households, cleaning and serving and maintaining the physical spaces where aristocratic lives unfolded. They saw things they were not supposed to see, heard supposed to hear. And sometimes what they saw and heard made its way into print. The seasonal rhythm of aristocratic life shaped the production of scandal. The London season ran roughly from late autumn through early summer, corresponding to when Parliament was in session. This was when fashionable society was concentrated in London, when balls and parties and assemblies happened nearly every night, when scandals emerged and were reported with regularity. The scandal sheets published their juiciest content during the season because that was when there was the most material to report, and when readership was highest. In summer, society dispersed to country estates. The newspapers had less scandal to report, and their readership declined. The focus of reporting shifted somewhat, covering summer activities like races at Epsom or Ascot, reporting on who was staying at which country houses, following the movements of the royal family to their summer residences. But the pace was slower, the content less salacious. Scandals that developed during the summer might be mentioned but were often saved for fuller reporting when society returned to London in the autumn. This seasonal rhythm meant that scandals had a kind of life cycle. Something might happen in the spring, be reported extensively for a few weeks, then fade as summer arrived and people left London. When society reconvened in the autumn, and the scandal would be old news, no longer interesting unless new developments had occurred. This gave people accused of scandalous behavior a natural respite. They could leave London for the summer, spend months at their country estates, and return in autumn to a society that had moved on to newer scandals and fresher gossip. Sincerest, where newspapers reported events as they happened. Magazines might publish essays or fictional stories that reflected on scandal more generally. A magazine essay might discuss the nature of reputation or the cruelty of gossip without naming specific people. Or it might publish a story presented as fiction, but clearly based on real events that explored the consequences of scandal on the people involved. These magazine pieces reached a different audience than the daily scandal sheets. They were more likely to be read by women, circulated in provincial areas, more likely to be saved and reread rather than discarded after a single reading. They shaped the broader cultural conversation about scandal, gossip, and reputation in ways that complemented the more immediate reporting of newspapers. Society novels that became popular during the Regency period existed in an interesting space between fiction and reportage. These were full-length novels with plots and character development and literary ambition, but they were also romans or clef novels with keys where the fictional characters represented real people. Reading these novels became a kind of game for people familiar with fashionable society. You would read about a beautiful duchess having an affair with a dashing cavalry officer, and you would try to figure out who they really were. Sometimes the clues were obvious, other times they were subtle, requiring detailed knowledge of society to interpret. The authors of these novels were often women with intimate access to the world they were describing. Lady Charlotte Berry, who was mentioned earlier, was one such author. She had been a lady-in-waiting to Princess Caroline and had witnessed the dysfunction of the royal marriage firsthand. Her novels drew on this experience, depicting a high society world full of unhappy marriages, secret affairs, and social cruelty. She published anonymously at first, protecting herself from the consequences of too directly depicting her social circle, but eventually her identity became known, which itself became a scandal, with some people cutting her socially for having written so openly about the world she inhabited. Other female novelists took similar risks. They wrote about what they knew, which was the complex social world of courtship, marriage, and social hierarchy. Their novels were popular precisely because they felt authentic. because readers recognized the truth in the situations depicted even when the names were changed. These novels sold well, making some of their authors financially independent. This was its own kind of scandal, women earning substantial money from writing, supporting themselves through their literary work, rather than through marriage or family wealth. The question of who controlled information in this world was complex and shifting. Publishers and editors had obvious power. They decided what to print and what to suppress. But they depended on sources for information, which gave those sources power as well. Aristocrats who cultivated relationships with journalists could shape coverage to some degree. Servants who sold information had a kind of power over their employers. Caricaturists who chose which scandals to depict and how to depict them exercised creative power that had real-world consequences, and readers themselves had power through their choices about what to purchase and read and discuss. The scandal sheets existed because people bought them. The market for gossip and scandal was driven by reader demand. If people stopped buying newspapers that printed scandalous content, the newspapers would change their content or go out of business. But people did not stop buying them. They bought them eagerly, read them thoroughly, discussed them endlessly. The appetite for scandal seemed inexhaustible. This raises questions about why scandal was so fascinating to people then, as it remains now. Part of it was simple curiosity about the lives of the wealthy and powerful. Most people did not attend balls at aristocratic mansions or summer at country estates. Reading about these things allowed a kind of vicarious participation in a world they would never directly experience. It was entertainment, a form of storytelling where the characters and events were real rather than invented. But there was also something more complex happening. The scandal sheets allowed people to feel superior to the aristocracy they were reading about. A middle-class merchant reading about a duke's affair could feel morally superior to someone whose title and wealth far exceeded his own. The aristocracy might have power and privilege, but they were also revealed to be flawed, human, subject to the same weaknesses and failings as everyone else. This was satisfying in a way that went beyond simple curiosity. For women readers especially, the scandal sheets provided a form of education about the dangers of the social world. Young women could read about what happened to women who were not careful about their reputations, who trusted the wrong men, who made mistakes that led to social ruin. The scandal sheets were cautionary tales, even as they were entertainment. They taught lessons about reputation, discretion, and the double standards that governed women's behavior. The fact that most scandals centered on sex and relationships rather than, say, financial fraud or political corruption is itself significant. These were the scandals that sold papers, the stories that readers wanted to follow. A man who embezzled money might be reported on, certainly, but the coverage would be brief compared to a woman whose affair was discovered. This reflected the values and priorities of the society. Reputation and honor were bound up primarily with sexual behavior, especially for women. Other forms of misbehavior were less interesting, less scandalous, less worthy of extensive coverage. The anonymous pamphlets that occasionally appeared added another dimension to the scandal ecosystem. These were not regular publications but one-off productions that appeared suddenly and circulated widely before disappearing. A pamphlet might purport to tell the true story of some scandal, providing details that newspapers had only hinted at, or it might be an attack on a specific person, describing their behavior in explicit and damning terms. These pamphlets were difficult to trace back to their source, which made them potentially more dangerous than newspaper reports. Someone with a grudge could publish a pamphlet destroying someone's reputation, and there would be little the victim could do about it. Some of these pamphlets were crude in their presentation, hastily printed on cheap paper with numerous errors. Others were more sophisticated, well-written and well-printed, suggesting a wealthy backer who had hired professionals to produce them. They might be sold by street vendors or left in public places where people would find and read them. The most sensational ones would be copied and reprinted and passed from hand to hand until they had reached an audience far larger than the initial print run. The line between legitimate newspapers and these more dubious publications was not always clear. Some newspapers were little better than scandal sheets, existing primarily to print gossip and sensation. Others maintained a veneer of respectability while still including substantial scandal content. The most respectable papers tried to limit their coverage of scandal to factual reporting about court cases or official matters, avoiding pure gossip. But even they included columns of fashionable intelligence. And even they were not above printing information that damaged reputations when they judged it newsworthy. The legal framework around libel was important, but not determinative. The laws existed and could be enforced, but enforcement was expensive and time-consuming and not always successful. To sue for libel, you had to prove that what was printed about you was false and had damaged your reputation. If the reports were true, you had no case, and proving they were false meant providing evidence that might itself be embarrassing or that might not exist. Many people who were subjects of scandalous reporting chose not to sue, judging that a lawsuit would only draw more attention to the scandal and prolong its life in the public discourse. The newspapers knew this, and it made them bolder. They understood that most people would not sue, that the risk of a libel case was relatively small compared to the commercial benefit of printing scandalous content. So they pushed boundaries, printing things that were technically actionable but practically safe. Only when they made serious errors or when they attacked someone with both the resources and the determination to sue did they face real consequences. The relationship between scandal and social control was important. The threat of being written about in the scandal sheets was a form of discipline that helped maintain social norms. People knew that if they behaved in ways that violated those norms, they might be exposed publicly. This knowledge shaped behavior, encouraging conformity and discretion. The scandal sheets thus functioned as a kind of informal social police, enforcing standards of behavior through the threat of public exposure and shame. This function was conservative in the sense that it worked to preserve existing social arrangements. The scandals that were most heavily covered were those that violated traditional norms around marriage, fidelity, and sexual behavior. Behavior that challenged class boundaries, an actress marrying an earl, for example, was treated as scandalous. The scandal sheets might be entertaining, but they also worked to reinforce the social order, to punish deviation, to make examples of those who strayed too far from accepted norms. At the same time, the scandal sheets revealed the gap between ideal and reality in Regency society. The norms they enforced were regularly violated by the very people who were supposed to exemplify them. The aristocracy, who were meant to be paragons of virtue and honor, were revealed to be just as prone to adultery, gambling, drunkenness, and moral failure as anyone else. This revelation was itself significant, undermining the moral authority of the upper classes, even as the scandal sheets attempted to police their behavior. The cumulative effect of reading scandal sheet after scandal sheet, year after year, was to create a shared cultural knowledge about how high society functioned. Readers became expert in the codes and conventions of aristocratic life. They knew the names of all the important families, the connections between them, the histories of their scandals. They could follow a story about a duke's affair because they remembered reading about his marriage 10 years earlier and his previous affair 5 years before that. The scandal sheets created a kind of collective memory of aristocratic misbehavior that was both entertaining and instructive. For historians looking back, the scandal sheets are valuable evidence of daily life and social relations in ways that more official records are not. Letters and diaries might be carefully edited or destroyed. Official documents record only certain kinds of information, but the newspapers, in their hunger for scandal and their attention to detail, preserved vast amounts of information about how people actually lived. The triviality of much of the content does not diminish its historical value. Indeed, the triviality is part of what makes it valuable, offering glimpses into the texture of daily life that more serious sources ignore. The scandal sheets also reveal changing attitudes over time. What was considered scandalous in 1800 might be less scandalous by 1820, or new forms of scandal might emerge as society changed. Tracing these shifts through newspaper coverage provides a window into cultural evolution, showing how norms around behavior, gender, class, and sexuality developed through the Regency period and into the Victorian era that followed. The eventual decline of the Regency scandal sheet culture came gradually rather than suddenly. As Victorian attitudes took hold in the decades after 1830, there was increasing discomfort with the openness about sex and scandal that had characterized Regency reporting. Victorian newspapers were more restrained, more concerned with respectability, less willing to print details about aristocratic affairs and sexual scandal. The content did not disappear entirely. Scandal has never disappeared from newspapers, but it became more coded, more implicit, wrapped in euphemism and suggestion rather than stated directly. But in the Regency itself, in those years around 1810 or 1815, the scandal sheets flourished. They were everywhere, read by everyone, part of the fabric of daily life in a way that was specific to that moment. When we think about Bridgerton and Lady Whistledown's scandal sheets, we are thinking about a fictionalized version of something that was very real. The real scandal sheets were different in some ways. They did not name names so directly. They were produced by multiple publishers rather than one mysterious figure. They were part of a larger ecosystem of gossip and information. But the spirit was accurate. There really was this world where people's private lives were made public, where scandal was currency, where reputation could be destroyed or enhanced through the printed word. And that world was made possible by a specific set of historical circumstances. The technology of printing had advanced to where daily newspapers were feasible. London society was concentrated in space and time in a way that made it possible to observe and report on. Reading publics existed across England hungry for news about the fashionable world. Legal frameworks around libel existed but were not so restrictive as to prevent scandalous reporting. Economic incentives aligned to make scandal profitable. And cultural attitudes toward privacy, reputation, and public discourse created an environment where this kind of journalism could flourish. All of these factors came together in Regency England to create the golden age of scandal that we have been exploring. It was a moment when private became public, when secrets became stories, when the boundaries between lived experience and entertainment collapsed in ways that feel remarkably modern despite the 2 centuries that separate us from it. The names have changed and the technology has evolved, but the fundamental dynamics remain recognizable. We still have celebrity gossip. We still have anonymous sources dishing dirt on the famous. We still have a reading public hungry for these stories. We still navigate the tension between our stated values about privacy and dignity and our actual appetite for scandal and revelation. The Regency scandal sheets remind us that this is not new, that the cultural impulses they served have deep historical roots, that the conversation about privacy, reputation, scandal, and the public good is one we have been having for centuries. They also remind us that every age thinks its particular form of media, and scandal is unprecedented. But the Regency scandal sheets were themselves descended from earlier forms of gossip and scandal reporting, and our modern forms will be replaced by whatever comes next. The underlying human interests remain constant even as the mechanisms for serving them continuously evolve. The letters that survive from the Regency period offer glimpses into how individuals responded to being written about in the scandal sheet. Some letters express outrage and mortification. A woman might write to her sister describing her horror at finding herself mentioned in the morning papers, even though her name was disguised with initials. She knew that everyone who mattered would recognize her, would understand the reference, would be talking about her over breakfast. The humiliation was profound, the sense of violation complete. Her private life had been made public without her consent, and there was nothing she could do to undo it. Other letters reveal a more strategic response. Someone might write describing how they had arranged for a favorable story to be planted in a particular newspaper, countering gossip that had appeared elsewhere. Or they might describe avoiding certain events or certain peoples, specifically to avoid giving the scandal sheets more material to work with. These letters show people actively managing their relationship with the press, understanding that they lived in a fishbowl and taking steps to control what observers could see. Still other letters suggest a kind of weary acceptance. People who had been subjects of gossip for years seemed to develop a thick skin, learning not to care what was written about them, or at least learning to pretend not to care. They might mention a scandalous report about themselves in a letter and then brush it aside with a joke or a dismissive comment. This attitude was easier to maintain if you had secure social position, if you knew that your family and true friends would stand by you regardless of what appeared in print. The diaries kept by some Regency figures provide another window into this world. A diary entry might describe attending a ball and being aware that journalists were present, watching, taking notes. Or it might record the diarist's reaction to reading something about themselves or their friends in the morning papers. These private records reveal the emotional toll of living under constant observation, the anxiety it created, the way it made even private moments feel public, because you never knew who might be watching or who might talk to a newspaper afterward. Some diaries also reveal how people consumed scandal about others. They describe the pleasure of reading a juicy piece of gossip over breakfast, the entertainment value of following some aristocratic drama as it unfolded in the papers over weeks or months. These entries are honest about the appeal of scandal, about the satisfaction of knowing other people's secrets, about the enjoyment derived from watching high society people make mistakes and suffer consequences. The account books kept by publishers show the commercial side of this world. We can see how many copies of a newspaper sold on a particular day, which editions sold best, what the costs of production were, what the profit margins looked like. These records make clear that scandal was lucrative. Newspapers that featured extensive gossip columns sold better than those that focused primarily on political or commercial news. Publishers understood this and adjusted their content accordingly. They hired writers who could produce entertaining scandal pieces. They cultivated sources who could provide fresh gossip. They invested in distribution networks to get their papers into as many hands as possible. The economics of scandal sheets were such that even a relatively modest publication could be profitable. The costs of production were low paper and ink and labor, plus small payments to writers and sources. The potential readership was large enough that even capturing a fraction of it could generate good income. Multiple publications competed for readers, which drove quality up in some ways. The better written, better sourced scandal sheets attracted more readers and could charge more for advertisements. The cycle reinforced itself, with commercial success enabling further investment in content that brought more readers and more success. Advertising in these publications is itself revealing. The products advertised were often aimed at helping people navigate the social world the scandal sheets described. There were advertisements for dressmakers and tailors who could provide fashionable clothing, for dancing masters who could teach you the latest steps, for manuals on etiquette and behavior, for beauty products that promised to enhance your appearance, for social guides that listed who was who in fashionable society. All of these products and services existed to help people either join the world being described or improve their position within it. Some advertisements were more directly connected to the scandal content. There were advertisements for books that promised to reveal the secrets of high society, for pamphlets that would provide keys to decode the initials used in recent scandal reports, for portraits of famous courtesans or notorious aristocrats, for caricatures depicting recent scandals. The advertising and editorial content worked together to create a whole ecosystem around scandal and gossip, each reinforcing the other, all of it driven by reader interest and commercial incentive. The coffeehouse culture that was so central to how news circulated had its own rhythms and rituals. A gentleman entering his preferred coffeehouse in mid-morning might find it already full of other men, all reading newspapers and discussing what they contained. The conversations moved from table to table, information flowing freely. Someone might read a scandalous item aloud, provoking laughter or commentary. Someone else might add information they had heard through other channels, elaborating on what the newspaper had reported. The coffeehouse proprietors understood that newspapers were essential to attracting customers. They subscribed to multiple publications and made them freely available. A man might come in primarily to read the papers rather than to drink coffee. He would spend an hour or two working through the various newspapers, making notes about items of particular interest, occasionally joining in conversations about what he was reading. The coffeehouse provided both the material, the newspapers themselves, and the social context for consuming them collectively rather than individually. This collective consumption was important. Reading a scandal sheet alone was one experience. Reading it in a coffeehouse surrounded by other men who were reading the same material and discussing it was something different. The social dimension enhanced the entertainment value and also shaped interpretation. If everyone in the coffeehouse was laughing about a particular scandal, it became funny even if reading it alone you might have found it merely sad or sordid. The collective response shaped individual response, creating shared cultural meanings around the scandals being reported. The clubs were similar but more exclusive and more politically charged. Where coffee houses were relatively open to any man who could pay for coffee, the clubs were membership organizations with stringent entry requirements. Getting into White's or Brooks's required sponsorship by existing members and approval through a voting process that could blackball candidates for any reason or no reason at all. Once in, you had access to a social world that was deeply intertwined with political power and high society. The betting books in these clubs were legendary. They were large volumes bound in leather, kept in prominent places where members could consult them and add new bets. The entries were written by hand, signed by the bettors and by witnesses. Some bets were straightforward wagers on horse races or political outcomes. Others were more personal, betting on whether a particular couple would marry, whether someone's wife was having an affair, whether a pregnant woman would deliver a boy or a girl. whether someone would successfully seduce someone else within a specified time frame. These personal bets were essentially formalized gossip. By writing a bet into the book, you were making a public statement about something you believed or suspected about someone's private life. The bet might concern people who were members of the club themselves or who were connected to members through family or social ties. Recording the bet in the official betting book gave it a kind of weight and permanence. And when bets from the clubs found their way into newspapers, as they sometimes did, the gossip reached an even wider audience. The clubs also hosted gambling of a more conventional sort, and the stakes could be ruinous. Men gambled on cards, whist and faro were popular, and some lost fortunes in a single night. The newspapers sometimes reported on spectacular gambling losses, particularly if they involved well-known figures. A report might note that Lord so-and-so had lost £10,000 at Brooks's last night, a sum that would be devastating to most families but that the lord in question might be able to absorb, given his vast estates and income. The culture of gambling was itself somewhat scandalous, or at least it occupied an ambiguous moral space. Gambling was associated with dissipation and irresponsibility, with young men wasting inheritances and neglecting duties. Moralists condemned it. Yet it was also central to the social world of masculine aristocratic culture, a marker of status and daring. To gamble heavily was to demonstrate that you could afford to lose, that money meant little to you. The scandal sheets reported on gambling both as entertainment and as cautionary tale, showing readers the glamorous and destructive sides of this aspect of high society life. The presence of courtesans and mistresses in Regency society was openly acknowledged in ways that might surprise modern readers. These were women who lived outside the bounds of respectable society, but who moved through the same physical and social spaces as respectable women. They attended the theatre and opera, though they sat in different boxes. They walked in the parks and pleasure gardens, though at different times or in different areas. They were known to everyone, their identities no secret, their relationships with their aristocratic protectors, a matter of public knowledge. The newspapers reported on these women with a frankness that would not have been possible in the Victorian era that followed. A courtesan might be named directly in a scandal sheet, her presence at a particular event noted, her current protector identified, speculation offered about whether the relationship would last or whether she would soon move on to someone else. These reports were written in a tone that mixed fascination with disapproval, acknowledging these women's beauty and charm while also making clear their fallen status. Some courtesans achieved a kind of celebrity status themselves. Harriet Wilson was perhaps the most famous, known not just for her beauty, but for her wit and for the high-ranking men who sought her company. When she decided late in life to publish her memoirs, it caused a sensation. She sent letters to former lovers offering them the opportunity to pay her not to include them in the book. Some paid, others refused, gambling that she would not really name names or that they could withstand the scandal. She published the memoirs anyway, and they were full of detailed, devastating portraits of the men she had known. The book sold enormously well, everyone read it or wanted to read it. And the scandal sheets covered the scandal of the memoirs themselves, creating a meta-scandal that consumed society for months. The memoirs were significant because they reversed the usual power dynamic of scandal. Normally, women were the subjects of scandalous reporting, men the observers and commentators. But Harriet Wilson's memoirs made men the subjects, exposing their behavior, revealing their weaknesses, holding them accountable in print for how they had treated her and women like her. Some men tried to suppress the book, but this only made it more sought after. The whole episode demonstrated how scandal could be weaponized, how the power of the printed word could be turned against the powerful by someone willing to sacrifice their own reputation to damage others. The legal aftermath of the memoirs was complex. Some of what Wilson wrote was demonstrably true and therefore not libelous. Other parts were perhaps exaggerated or distorted, but proving this would require men to admit publicly that they had been involved with a courtesan, which would itself be embarrassing. So most chose not to sue, preferring to endure the scandal and hope it would fade rather than prolong it through legal action. The memoirs remained in circulation, and Harriet Wilson became even more famous, her notoriety ensuring that her name would be remembered long after the men she wrote about were forgotten. The question of memory and forgetting was important in this culture of scandal. Some scandals were remembered for decades. If your grandmother had been involved in a famous affair in the 1780s, people still remembered it in 1810, and it might still color how your family was perceived. Other scandals faded quickly, replaced by newer ones, forgotten, except by those directly involved. The newspapers themselves were ephemeral objects, meant to be read once and discarded. Yesterday's paper was worthless, useful only for wrapping fish or starting fires, so the scandals they reported had a built-in obsolescence. Unless something was shocking enough to be remembered and discussed for years afterward, it disappeared from collective memory as surely as the newspapers themselves disappeared into the trash. But some people kept newspapers, collecting them in bound volumes or filing them away for reference. Libraries and reading rooms maintained archives of newspapers, which meant that even old scandals could be revisited if someone cared to look. And occasionally someone would care to look, perhaps researching a family history or seeking information about a past event. These archives meant that nothing was truly forgotten, that any scandal could potentially be resurrected if circumstances made it relevant again. The relationship between past and present scandal was dynamic. A current scandal might recall an earlier one, and newspapers would make the connection explicit, reminding readers of what had happened 20 years ago. This gave scandal reporting a kind of historical depth, situating current events within longer narratives of family behavior, social patterns. The moralizing that accompanied scandal reporting was interesting in its inconsistency. Sometimes newspapers would condemn scandalous behavior in the strongest terms, presenting themselves as guardians of public morality, shocked and dismayed by aristocratic excess. Other times, the same newspapers would report the exact same types of behavior in tones that suggested amusement or even admiration. This inconsistency reflected the competing impulses at work. The desire to condemn vice conflicting with the desire to entertain readers with tales of vice. The need to maintain some pretense of moral seriousness clashing with the commercial reality that scandal sold papers. Religious publications and reform-minded periodicals took a harder line, using scandals as evidence of moral decay among the upper classes and calling for reform. These publications were generally less interested in the entertaining details and more interested in what scandals revealed about the spiritual and moral condition of the nation. They might report on the same events as the scandal sheets, but in very different language, with explicit moral commentary and calls for repentance and reform. The contrast between these different types of reporting revealed the fragmented nature of print culture in the Regency period. Different publications served different audiences and purposes. A genteel lady in a provincial town might read the scandal sheets for entertainment, but also subscribe to a religious magazine that condemned the very behaviors those scandal sheets described. A London gentleman might read both the political news and the gossip columns in the same newspaper, finding both equally interesting in different ways. The variety of available publications meant that readers could find content that matched their interests and values, but it also meant that there was no single shared culture of print, no unanimous interpretation of the scandals being reported. The social season that structured aristocratic life and determined when scandal was most abundant had its own internal rhythms. The season began slowly as families returned to London from their country estates in late autumn. The pace picked up through December and into January. By February and March, the season was at its height, with balls and parties nearly every night, Parliament in full session, everyone who mattered present and active. April and May saw the season continue at full intensity. But by June, people began to leave London. Some went to Bath or other resort towns. Others returned to their estates. By August, London was largely emptied of fashionable society. This rhythm meant that scandal production and consumption had a seasonal quality. The scandal sheets published their richest content during the height of the season, when there was the most material to report and the most readers available to consume it. Summer issues were thinner, more focused on court news or summer entertainments like races or regattas. The autumn issues began to pick up as society returned, with anticipatory reports about who was expected in town, which parties were being planned, what the season ahead might hold. The predictability of this rhythm allowed newspapers to plan ahead. They knew that certain types of events would happen at certain times. Court presentations of débutantes happened in the spring, major balls were concentrated in the winter and early spring months, the races at Ascot happened in June. They could prepare coverage frameworks in advance, knowing that whatever specific scandals emerged, they would fit into these predictable patterns of social activity. The debutante presentations were particularly rich sources of scandal and gossip. These were the formal introductions of young women to society, presented at court to the Queen as markers of their eligibility for marriage. The selms were reported in newspapers, who had been presented, what they wore, who had sponsored them. But the presentations also marked the beginning of a young woman's participation in the marriage market, and newspapers would track their progress through the season. Who danced with the new debutantes, which young men seemed interested in, which young women, were engagements forming. The mothers of debutantes were intensely concerned with how their daughters were reported. A favorable mention in a newspaper could help a young woman's prospects. An unfavorable mention, or worse, a scandalous report, could damage them permanently. So mothers worked to manage the press, cultivating relationships with society reporters, providing information that showed their daughters in good light, trying to suppress anything negative. Despite these efforts, scandals involving young women did occur and were reported. A debutante might be seen in compromising circumstances with an inappropriate man. She might behave badly at a ball, getting drunk or making a scene. She might elope, throwing aside family plans for her marriage in favor of her own choice of partner. All of these scenarios provided rich material for scandal sheets, which reported them with varying degrees of sympathy or condemnation depending on circumstances and editorial philosophy. Elopements were particularly scandalous and particularly good stories. Some classic scenario involved a young woman of good family running away with a man her family opposed, perhaps someone of lower social rank, or someone with a bad reputation, or simply someone other than the wealthy aristocrat her parents had chosen for her. The couple would flee to Gretna Green in Scotland, where English marriage laws did not apply and they could marry without parental consent. The newspapers would report the elopement as it happened, tracking the couple's flight, speculating about whether they would be caught, describing the family's reaction. These elopement stories had built-in drama that made them perfect for newspapers. There was flight and pursuit, romance and rebellion, family honor and individual desire, all in conflict. The outcome mattered. Did the couple successfully marry? Did the family reconcile with them or disown them? How did society react? But the story itself was compelling regardless of outcome, and newspapers milked it for all it was worth, publishing updates every day as the story developed. The Gretna Green marriages were controversial because they circumvented the proper social processes for marriage among the upper classes. Marriage was supposed to be a carefully arranged alliance between families, with settlements negotiated and contracts signed and all details properly managed. An elopement bypassed all of that, allowing individuals to marry based on personal preference rather than family strategy. This was seen as dangerous, a threat to the social order, and the scandal sheets both reflected and reinforced this view even as they made the elopements themselves into entertaining stories. The question of love versus duty in marriage was central to much scandal reporting. The ideal aristocratic marriage balanced both: you married someone appropriate to your rank and family interests, but hopefully you also developed affection for them. Ascent reality often fell short of the ideal. Some marriages were purely strategic, with no affection between the partners. Others were love matches that crossed social boundaries or ignored family wishes. The scandal sheets reported on both types, showing readers the consequences of different choices. The unhappy marriages that resulted from purely strategic matches often generated ongoing scandal. A couple who married for family reasons and then discovered they could not stand each other might maintain appearances for a while, but eventually their unhappiness became visible. They stopped appearing together at social events. They were seen in the company of other people. Rumors began to circulate about affairs on one or both sides. Eventually their estrangement might be openly reported in newspapers, their marriage acknowledged as failed even if divorce remained impossible or socially unacceptable. Divorce in the Regency period was extraordinarily difficult and expensive. It honored an Act of Parliament, which meant that only the very wealthy could afford it, and it carried enormous social stigma, particularly for women. A divorced woman was ruined socially, excluded from respectable society, separated from her children in most cases. Men faced less severe consequences, but still suffered damage to their reputations. As a result, divorce was rare. Most unhappy marriages persisted indefinitely, the couple eventually working out some arrangement that allowed them to live separate lives while maintaining the legal and social fiction of marriage. The newspapers reported on the few divorces that did occur with intense interest. Divorce proceedings were public, with evidence of adultery or other marital failures presented in Parliament. The testimony could be extraordinarily intimate and damaging. Servants might be called to testify about what they had observed. Letters might be read aloud. The details of who had done what with whom and when and where, all of it became public record and was duly reported in the press. The most famous divorce scandal of the Regency period involved the Prince of Wales and Princess Caroline. Their marriage had been disastrous from the start. They could not stand each other. They separated soon after the birth of their daughter, and for years they lived apart, each conducting affairs more or less openly. The newspapers reported on all of it: the prince's various mistresses, the princess's inappropriate behavior, the political implications of their estrangement. When the prince became King George IV in 1820, he attempted to divorce Caroline. This required bringing formal charges against her in Parliament. The proceedings were a spectacle, with detailed testimony about Caroline's alleged affairs presented to the House of Lords and reported extensively in every newspaper in England. The public largely sympathized with Caroline, seeing her as wronged by a husband who was himself notoriously unfaithful. The divorce attempt failed, though Caroline was effectively excluded from court and from her position as queen. The whole affair demonstrated how scandal involving the royal family could become a national political crisis, with newspapers playing a crucial role in shaping public opinion. The symbiotic relationship between scandal and politics was visible throughout the Regency period. Political figures were subject to the same scandal reporting as social figures, and their private behavior could have political consequences. A politician involved in a sexual scandal might lose credibility and influence. Conversely, political enemies might leak or manufacture scandals to damage each other, using newspapers as weapons in political conflicts. The caricatures that accompanied newspaper reporting were particularly effective as political weapons. A well-executed caricature could destroy someone's reputation more effectively than 1,000 words of text. The visual impact was immediate and memorable. People who could barely read could understand a caricature, and the humor, however savage, made the images more shareable and more likely to be remembered. Some caricatures depicted political scandals with elaborate allegories. A minister accused of corruption might be shown as a pig at a trough. A politician who changed positions might be shown with multiple faces. These images circulated widely, published as prints that people could purchase and display. The most popular caricatures were copied and reproduced, spreading far beyond their original publication. The relationship between visual and textual scandal was complementary. Text could provide detail and nuance that images could not. Images could provide impact and memorability that text lacked. Together, they created a multimedia scandal culture that was more powerful than either form alone. Someone reading about a scandal in a newspaper might then seek out a caricature depicting it. Someone seeing a caricature in a shop window might then buy a newspaper to get the full story. The shop windows where caricatures were displayed became sites of public gathering and discussion. People would stop to look at the latest prints, laughing and commenting, sometimes recognizing the figures depicted, sometimes needing others to explain the references. The print shop window functioned as a kind of public gallery where scandal was both displayed and discussed, where private behavior became public spectacle. The print sellers themselves were important figures in this ecosystem. They commissioned work from caricaturists, published and sold the results, and sometimes faced legal consequences when their prints crossed lines of acceptability. Some print sellers became famous in their own right, known for publishing the most daring or scandalous images. Their shops became destinations for those seeking the latest gossip rendered in visual form. The economic model of the print trade was different from newspapers. Where newspapers were cheap and disposable, prints were more expensive and meant to be kept. A well-executed caricature might sell hundreds of copies at several shillings each, providing good income for both the artist and the publisher. The most successful caricaturists earned substantial sums, enough to live comfortably on their art. This created incentives to produce the most scandalous, most memorable images possible. The targets of these caricatures had little recourse. Suing for libel over an image was even more difficult than suing over text. How did you prove that a caricature was false when it was clearly exaggerated and satirical from the start? The legal protections for satire were stronger than for factual reporting, so caricaturists could get away with visual attacks that would have been actionable if written as text. Some people collected caricatures the way others collected art. They would purchase prints and bind them in volumes or mount them in portfolios. These collections served as visual archives of scandal, allowing owners to review and remember the gossip and controversies of previous years. And some of these collections survive in museums and libraries today, providing historians with rich visual evidence of Regency scandal culture. The theatrical world that intersected with high society generated its own distinct category of scandal. Theatres were semi-public spaces where different social ranks mixed more freely than they did elsewhere. The boxes were for aristocracy, but anyone could sit in the pit or the gallery. This mixing created opportunities for encounters across class boundaries that might not happen elsewhere. The green rooms backstage were where aristocratic men could meet actresses after performances. These were semi-private spaces where social rules were relaxed. An introduction to an actress might lead to a conversation, which might lead to an arrangement. Some actresses supplemented their theatre income by becoming mistresses to wealthy men. This was widely understood and generally accepted as part of how the theatrical world worked. The newspapers reported on these relationships with varying degrees of openness. An actress might be described as under the protection of a particular nobleman, a phrase that everyone understood to mean she was his mistress. The details of the arrangement, how much he paid her, where she lived, whether the relationship was exclusive, might be hinted at or reported more directly depending on how scandalous the relationship was considered to be. Some actresses played the game skillfully, using scandal and publicity to enhance their careers and their market value as potential mistresses. Being talked about in newspapers kept you in the public eye, made you more famous, increased the prices you could command both as an actress and as a mistress. So some actresses courted scandal rather than avoiding it, understanding that notoriety could be profitable. Others tried to maintain respectability, separating their professional work from their personal lives, declining the offers that inevitably came from wealthy men in the audience. This was harder because theatres paid actresses relatively little, and the financial temptation of accepting a wealthy protector was substantial. But some managed it, building careers based on talent and maintaining reputations as respectable professionals. The treatment of actresses in scandal sheets reflected broader attitudes about women, class and morality. Actresses occupied an ambiguous position. They were public women, performing for audiences, but they were also working women supporting themselves through their labor. This combination of publicity and independence made them suspect in the eyes of respectable society. The scandal sheets both reflected and reinforced this suspicion, treating actresses as more available for scandal than women of the upper classes. The opera world was even more connected to scandal and aristocratic patronage. Opera was expensive to produce and attracted a wealthy audience. The opera boxes were the most expensive seats at any performance, and they were treated as semi-private spaces where aristocratic patrons could entertain and conduct business and carry on affairs with relative privacy. The curtains on the boxes could be drawn, closing off the occupants from view. What happened behind those curtains was sometimes reported in scandal sheets, sometimes left to imagination and rumor. Opera singers, particularly the female singers who came from Italy and elsewhere on the continent, were often closely associated with aristocratic patrons. A soprano might be under the protection of a duke, living in a house he provided, her career managed by him, her personal life entangled with his. These arrangements were reported in newspapers as facts of operatic life, notable but not particularly shocking given the continental origins of the performers and the different moral standards associated with them. The question of nationality and morality was interesting in scandal reporting. Continental Europeans, particularly Italians and French, were assumed to have more relaxed moral standards than the English. Affairs that might be scandalous if conducted by English people were treated as more acceptable if they involved foreigners. This double standard appeared frequently in newspaper reports, which might describe an Italian opera singer's multiple lovers in tones of amused tolerance, while condemning an English woman for a single affair. The Sunday newspapers had a slightly different character than the daily publications. They were larger, more substantial, meant to be read more slowly over the course of a leisurely day when people were not occupied with business. The Sunday papers included more extensive coverage of the previous week's events, summaries of scandals that had unfolded day by day, retrospectives on particularly interesting stories. They were more likely to include essays and commentary alongside straightforward reporting, giving readers a chance to reflect on the meaning of the scandals they had been following. The Sunday editions were also more likely to be read by women. During the week, newspapers were primarily male territory, consumed in coffeehouses and clubs and offices. But Sunday papers came into homes and were read by entire families. This meant that their content had to navigate different expectations about propriety. They still included scandal, certainly, but it was often framed more morally, with clearer judgments about right and wrong, more explicit lessons about the consequences of vice. The serialization of scandal over days and weeks created narrative momentum that kept readers engaged. A story might break on a Monday with initial reports of some incident. Tuesday's paper would add more details. Wednesday might bring reactions from other parties or speculation about consequences. Thursday could include commentary and analysis. By the time the Sunday paper came out, the story would be ready for a comprehensive retrospective that tied all the threads together. The serialization was similar to how novels were published in installments, creating anticipation and ongoing engagement with the story. The letters to the editor that some newspapers published added another dimension to scandal culture. Readers would write in with their own observations or opinions about scandals being reported. Sometimes these letters were genuine expressions of reader sentiment. Other times they were clearly planted by interested parties trying to shape the narrative around a particular scandal. A letter might defend someone accused of scandalous behavior, offering alternative explanations or attacking the credibility of the original reports. Another letter might add fuel to the fire, claiming additional information that made the scandal worse. These letters created a sense of dialogue between newspaper and readers, making scandal reporting feel participatory rather than purely top-down. Readers could insert themselves into the conversation, share their views, feel that their opinions mattered. Whether the letters were genuine or manufactured, they enhanced engagement by making readers feel they were part of a larger community. The provincial newspapers that reprinted London scandal added their own local commentary. A newspaper in York or Bath might include a London scandal column copied from a metropolitan paper, but then add local perspective on how the scandal was being received in their area. This created interesting echoes, with the same scandal discussed and interpreted differently across geographic distance. What seemed outrageous in London might seem merely interesting in the provinces. What Londoners dismissed as trivial might strike provincial readers as shocking. The time lag in news distribution meant that provincial readers were always a few days behind events in London. By the time they read about a scandal, it might have already developed new complications in the capital. This created a kind of doubled experience of scandal, where the initial report was followed days later by updates that changed or complicated the story. Provincial readers following a London scandal were always playing catch-up, always awaiting the next mail coach that would bring the latest newspapers with the newest developments. The social rituals around reading newspapers shaped how scandal was consumed and discussed. In homes, the paterfamilias might read the newspaper first at breakfast, sharing selected items with family members or keeping scandalous content to himself. The newspaper would then circulate through the household, read by others at different times of day. By evening, the family might discuss what they had read, sharing reactions and opinions, debating what various scandals meant. The conversation at dinner parties often turned to the latest scandals reported in newspapers. Discussing scandal was acceptable entertainment, a way of filling time and demonstrating that you were informed about the social world. The conversation followed certain patterns, certain rules. Direct gossip about people you knew personally was considered crude. But discussing scandals reported in newspapers was acceptable because the newspaper had already made the information public. You were not spreading gossip, but rather commenting on news. The social game involved demonstrating your knowledge while maintaining plausible deniability about caring too much. You wanted to show you had read the papers and understood the references, that you could identify the people behind the initials and coded descriptions. But you also wanted to maintain a pose of being above it all, of reading about scandal with detached amusement rather than prurient interest. The skill was in walking that line, being knowledgeable but not obsessed, entertained but not compromised. The scandal sheets also functioned as social guides for those trying to navigate high society from outside it. A merchant's daughter who had married into minor aristocracy might use newspaper reports to learn how her new social world operated. What kinds of events did fashionable people attend? What did they wear? How did they behave? The scandal reports, even as they documented misbehavior, also established norms by showing what exceeded them. You learned what not to do by reading about what others did wrong. The fashion information included in many scandal columns served a similar function. Reports would describe in detail what prominent women wore to various events: the fabric, the color, the cut of the dress, the jewelry and accessories. This information was valuable to women trying to stay current with fashion or aspiring to enter fashionable society. By reading these descriptions, you could learn what was in style and attempt to replicate it within your means. Some newspapers employed what we might now call fashion correspondents, writers who specialized in describing dress and appearance. Their columns mixed fashion reporting with scandal, noting not just what people wore but with whom they wore it, where they were seen, what their presence at particular events suggested about their social standing or romantic entanglements. Fashion and scandal were intertwined, both part of the same project of documenting and interpreting the visible surface of high society life. The cost of fashionable dress was sometimes reported as scandal in itself. A newspaper might note that Lady such and such had spent £2,000 on her wardrobe for the season, a sum that would support a working-class family for decades. These reports served multiple purposes. They demonstrated the wealth and extravagance of the aristocracy. They provided fodder for moral criticism of wasteful spending. And they satisfied reader curiosity about exactly how the wealthy spent their money. The jewels worn by prominent women received particular attention. Diamonds and other precious stones were markers of status, wealth made visible and portable. Newspapers would describe jewelry in detail: a necklace of rubies and diamonds, a tiara of emeralds, bracelets of pearls. Sometimes the reports included estimates of value, helping readers understand just how much wealth was being displayed. The jewelry descriptions served as a kind of aspirational fantasy for many readers, while also documenting the material culture of aristocratic display. The relationship between scandal and commerce extended beyond newspapers and caricatures. Scandal could affect business. A merchant or shopkeeper who was mentioned unfavorably in a scandal sheet might lose customers. Conversely, being known as a provider to famous or fashionable people could be excellent advertising. Some businesses actively sought mentions in society columns, providing information about their aristocratic clientele to journalists who would report it. The luxury trades, dressmakers, jewelers, wine merchants, carriage makers, all benefited from association with fashionable society. Having your establishment mentioned in a newspaper as the source of a duchess's dress or a duke's carriage was valuable publicity. Some businesses placed advertisements in newspapers that explicitly referenced their aristocratic clients, though this had to be done carefully to avoid offending those clients who might not want their purchases made public. The bankruptcy of aristocratic figures was always reported with interest, partly because it was scandalous and partly because it affected many people beyond the bankrupt individual. A lord's bankruptcy meant unpaid debts to tradespeople, servants dismissed without wages, tenants on his estates affected by the loss of their landlord's financial stability. The newspapers reported these bankruptcies in detail, listing creditors and amounts owed, describing the sale of property and possessions to pay debts. The fall from wealth to insolvency was a morality tale that readers found both cautionary and entertaining. Gambling losses were often at the root of aristocratic bankruptcy. A man who gambled for years beyond his means might accumulate debts that eventually became impossible to sustain. The newspapers had tracked his gambling through reports from clubs and race meetings, noting wins and losses, watching the trajectory toward inevitable disaster. When bankruptcy finally came, it was the culmination of a story that had been told in pieces over months or years. The fate of women in these bankruptcies was particularly pitiable and was sometimes reported with genuine sympathy. A wife whose husband bankrupted the family through gambling had no legal control over finances and no ability to prevent the disaster. When bankruptcy came, she might lose everything: her home, her possessions, her social position. If her family could help, she might return to them. If not, her prospects were grim. The newspapers that had reported gleefully on her husband's scandalous gambling might report more soberly on her subsequent poverty. The legal notices that appeared in newspapers included many related to debt and bankruptcy. These notices were required by law and provided a steady stream of information about the financial difficulties of various people. Readers could track who was being sued for debt, whose property was being seized, who had declared bankruptcy. This information was public record, but newspapers made it accessible and often added context or commentary that transformed dry legal notices into scandal narratives. The prison for debtors was a constant presence in the lives of those who lived beyond their means. A person who could not pay debts could be imprisoned indefinitely until the debt was paid, creating an impossible situation where imprisonment prevented the earning of money needed to pay debt and gain release. The newspapers occasionally reported on prominent people sent to debtors' prison, treating it as both scandal and tragedy. The fall from aristocratic splendor to prison was dramatic, and provided excellent material for moralizing about the dangers of extravagance and debt. The charities that operated to help imprisoned debtors sometimes appeared in newspapers, seeking donations. These appeals would describe the conditions in debtors' prisons, the suffering of those confined there, the need for charitable assistance to pay debts and secure release. The appeals were often framed as helping deserving poor who had fallen on hard times rather than helping aristocrats who had gambled away fortunes. But the latter group was sometimes the beneficiary, with friends and family quietly contributing to charity funds that would pay enough debt to secure release. The intersection of scandal and politics was particularly complex during the Regency period because this was a time of significant political tension. The war with France continued for much of the period, creating anxiety and requiring enormous expenditure. Political reform movements were gaining strength, demanding changes to voting rights and political representation. The economy experienced cycles of boom and depression. All of these serious political and economic issues shared space in newspapers, with scandal and gossip about the private lives of the same politicians who were making decisions about war and reform and economy. The newspapers themselves had political allegiances that shaped their reporting. Some papers were Whig in orientation, others Tory. Their political stance affected how they reported scandal. A scandal involving a Whig politician might be reported extensively and critically by a Tory paper while being minimized or defended by a Whig paper. Readers understood these biases and often read multiple papers to get different perspectives on the same events. The political use of scandal was strategic and calculated. If you wanted to damage a political opponent, leaking or manufacturing a personal scandal was often more effective than attacking their political positions. A politician who could defend his policies with logic and evidence might be helpless against accusations about his private life. The newspapers became vehicles for this kind of political warfare, with scandals weaponized for partisan advantage. Some political scandals crossed the line from personal gossip into genuine public importance. A minister accused of accepting bribes or using his position for personal enrichment was engaged in corruption that mattered to governance, not just personal morality. The newspapers reported these scandals extensively because they were legitimately newsworthy, not merely entertaining. But the line between personal and political scandal was not always clear, and newspapers did not always maintain consistent standards about what was legitimately public interest versus what was prurient gossip. The radical press that emerged during the Regency period took a different approach to scandal than the mainstream newspapers. These publications were more interested in exposing the corruption and hypocrisy of the ruling classes than in entertaining readers with gossip. They reported on scandal as evidence of systemic problems requiring political reform. The scandal about an aristocrat's affair was not just an amusing story but a demonstration of moral decay among the elite. A scandal about gambling debts showed the irresponsibility of those who claimed the right to govern. The radical papers faced more legal pressure than mainstream publications because they were more explicitly political and more threatening to the established order. The government used sedition and libel laws to prosecute radical publishers, attempting to suppress publications that called for reform and revolution. Some radical publishers went to prison, others fled the country. But the publications continued, often becoming more extreme in response to government pressure. The readership of radical papers was different from mainstream scandal sheets. These readers were more likely to be working class or middle class, more interested in politics than gossip, more motivated by anger at inequality than by curiosity about aristocratic behavior. But the radical papers still reported scandal because scandal was useful for their political purposes. They used scandal to delegitimize the aristocracy, to argue that the existing social and political order was corrupt and needed to be overturned. The mainstream scandal sheets generally avoided explicit political radicalism. They operated within the existing system, accepting aristocratic power and privilege while profiting from aristocratic misbehavior. Their scandal reporting was more conservative in its implications. It reinforced moral norms even as it reported violations of those norms. It entertained without threatening, revealing without destabilizing. This was what made them commercially successful and legally sustainable, while radical publications faced constant pressure and persecution. The memoirs and autobiographies published by some scandal figures added primary source material to the scandal ecosystem. When someone decided to tell their own story, they could control the narrative in ways that were impossible when others were writing about them. But they also risked revealing more than had been previously known, creating fresh scandals from old stories told with new detail. The reception of these memoirs was always mixed. Some readers valued them for their insider perspective and intimate knowledge. Others dismissed them as self-serving or unreliable, pointing out that people writing about themselves could hardly be objective. The newspapers reviewed these memoirs and often excerpted the most scandalous portions, creating scandal about the memoir itself beyond whatever scandals the memoir reported. The question of truth in these autobiographical accounts was difficult. People writing about their own lives had obvious biases and motivations to present themselves favorably, but they also had direct knowledge that no outside observer could match. Historians treating these memoirs as sources have to navigate between skepticism about bias and appreciation for insider information. The same was true for contemporary readers, who had to decide how much to believe of what they read. The letters and diaries that were sometimes published after people's deaths provided another source of scandal. A diary kept private during someone's lifetime might be published years or decades later, revealing scandals that had been hidden or forgotten. These posthumous publications created scandals at a temporal remove from the events themselves, but they were no less fascinating to readers. Some dead could no longer be hurt by revelation, but their families and descendants could be, and sometimes were. The ethics of publishing private letters and diaries was debated. Some argued that private documents should remain private, that publishing them violated the trust of the person who had written them. Others argued that historical figures had forfeited their right to privacy by being public people, that their papers were legitimate sources for understanding history and society. The law generally favored publication. Copyright belonged to the heirs who could decide whether to publish, and libel law did not protect the dead from defamation. The market for scandalous memoirs and published correspondence was strong enough to support a publishing industry around it. Publishers actively sought out manuscripts from or about famous people, knowing they would sell well. The heirs of deceased scandal figures sometimes found themselves in possession of documents that were valuable precisely because they were scandalous. Financial need might motivate publication even when family loyalty argued against it. The relationship between scandal and historical memory was complex. Some people were remembered primarily for their scandals rather than for anything else they accomplished. A woman might have been an accomplished hostess, a patron of the arts, a mother of prominent children, but if she was involved in a famous scandal, that might be all anyone remembered about her. The scandal became her defining characteristic, the thing that ensured she would not be forgotten, even as it distorted who she actually was. Other scandals faded from memory despite being extensively reported at the time. They seemed important when they happened, but did not enter the permanent historical record. This forgetting was selective and sometimes arbitrary. Some scandals were remembered because they involved particularly famous people. Others were remembered because they were repeatedly referenced by later writers, keeping them alive in collective memory. But many scandals that consumed newspaper space and public attention for weeks at the time disappeared completely, leaving no trace in historical memory. The archives that preserved newspapers and caricatures and memoirs ensured that even forgotten scandals could be recovered by historians. Someone researching a family history or writing a biography might uncover scandals that had not been thought about for generations. These archival discoveries could create fresh scandal, with modern descendants embarrassed or fascinated to learn what their ancestors had done. The past was never completely past as long as the documentary evidence survived. The changing standards of propriety over time meant that scandals evolved in their meanings. What had been scandalous in 1810 might seem innocent by 1860 or by 1960. Conversely, behavior that was accepted or only mildly scandalous in the Regency might seem shocking by later standards. Reading old scandal sheets gives a sense of how social norms shifted, how the boundaries of acceptable behavior changed, how different eras defined virtue and vice. The permanence of print created a historical record that captured scandal in ways that earlier oral gossip cultures could not. Before newspapers and printed scandal sheets, gossip was ephemeral, disappearing as soon as people stopped talking about it. But printed scandal was permanent. preserved in libraries and archives, available to be read decades or centuries later. This permanence had consequences. It meant that scandals could be remembered and revived, that reputations could be damaged long after the people involved were dead, that history would have access to intimate details of private lives in ways that earlier generations could not have imagined. The physical newspapers themselves, when they survive, carry traces of how they were used. Some show signs of careful reading, pages turned many times, certain items marked or underlined. Others show signs of more casual use, quickly read and discarded. Some were saved and bound into volumes, preserved as collections. Others were cut up, with individual articles or advertisements removed for some purpose. These physical traces tell us something about how readers engaged with scandal, what they found worth saving, what they marked as important, how they used newspapers as sources of information and entertainment. The digitization of historical newspapers in modern times has made scandal sheets accessible in new ways. Historians and genealogists and curious individuals can now search old newspapers for names and events, finding scandals that might otherwise have remained buried in archives. This has created new forms of engagement with historical scandal, people discovering that their ancestors were mentioned in scandal sheets, or researchers being able to track how particular scandals developed over time by searching multiple newspapers. The technology changes how we access the past, but the fascination with scandal remains constant. The lesson, perhaps, is continuity more than change. The scandal sheets of Regency England were products of their specific historical moment, but they spoke to human interests and curiosities that transcend any particular time or place. People have always been interested in the lives of the prominent and powerful. We have always enjoyed stories about love and sex and betrayal and downfall. We have always found entertainment in the troubles of others. We have always used gossip as a form of social bonding and social control. The Regency scandal sheets made these timeless human impulses visible and documented them in ways that earlier ages could not. The print technology and the commercial incentives and the social structures of the period combined to create a particular form of scandal culture, but underneath the historical specifics, the fundamental dynamics were not unique to the Regency. They appear in different forms in different eras, but they are always recognizable, always familiar. The people who wrote and published and read scandal sheets in 1810 were not so different from us. They lived in different circumstances, certainly. The social rules were different, the technology was different. But their curiosity about others, their enjoyment of gossip, their fascination with scandal, these were the same. Reading old scandal sheets is a way of connecting across time, recognizing ourselves in people long dead, seeing how human nature expresses itself consistently even as the surface circumstances of life change dramatically. The world that produced Bridgerton's Lady Whistledown was a real world where real scandal sheets circulated and real gossip consumed public attention. The show dramatizes and simplifies and makes it all more glamorous and entertaining than it might have been in reality, but the underlying truth is there. This was a world obsessed with reputation and scandal, where information was power and gossip was currency, where private lives became public entertainment, and where the printed word could make or destroy a person's standing in society. The Regency scandal sheet culture eventually gave way to Victorian restraint and different forms of scandal reporting, but it left its mark on English society and culture. It established patterns of celebrity journalism that continued in different forms. It demonstrated the commercial viability of scandal as content. It showed how information could be weaponized, how reputation could be managed, how the line between private and public could be constantly negotiated and contested. The historical record of Regency scandal is rich and detailed because so much of it was written down and printed and preserved. We can read the actual newspapers and see the actual scandals and understand in concrete detail how this world operated. This level of documentation allows us to recover not just the broad outlines but the specific texture of scandal culture in this period. We can see exactly what was written about whom and when and how. We can track individual scandals from first report through final outcome. We can understand the scandal sheets not as abstractions but as real objects produced by real people for real audiences. The pleasure of reading old scandal sheets is partly the pleasure of historical voyeurism, looking into private lives and intimate moments from a safe distance of 2 centuries. But it is also the pleasure of recognition, seeing reflected in these old pages the same concerns and fascinations that occupy modern tabloids and gossip websites. The names and technologies change, but the story remains fundamentally the same. People watching people, people talking about people, people finding entertainment and meaning in the scandals and dramas of lives lived in public view. The morning ritual of reading the scandal sheets over breakfast must have been similar to the modern ritual of checking social media or reading celebrity gossip websites. You wanted to know what had happened while you were asleep, what new developments had occurred in ongoing scandals, whether any new scandals had erupted. The anticipation was similar. The satisfaction of discovering fresh gossip, the pleasure of being among the first to know something, the excitement of having something to discuss with others. The social dynamics of sharing scandal were also similar across time. Then as now, sharing gossip was a way of bonding with others, of establishing intimacy through shared knowledge, of creating in-groups defined by who knew what. The person who had read the scandal sheets and could discuss the latest news had social capital, something valuable to contribute to conversation. The person who had not kept up with the scandal was excluded from parts of the social discourse, unable to participate in discussions that assumed shared knowledge. The moral complexity of scandal consumption was recognized even at the time. People knew that reading scandal sheets and enjoying gossip about others' misfortunes was not the highest form of human activity. There was ambivalence about it, a sense that it was somewhat shameful to be so interested in these stories. And yet people continued to read, continued to discuss, continued to care about scandals.